I'm Florence Eshalomi. Welcome to today's session of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. At this session, we're going to be looking at electoral policy. We've got a range of guests before us. Can I ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, and if anybody has any equitable interest? I'll start on that side. Joe, please.
Harold Kensington and Bayswater.
Chris Curtis, Milton Keynes North.
Sarah Smith, Hyndburn.
Maya Ellis, Ribble Valley.
Nisharba Khan, Gillingham and Raynham.
Will Forster, Woking.
Luke Taylor, Sutton Chin.
Lee Dillon, Newbury.
Thank you. Can I ask our guests just to introduce themselves for the record, please, and hands up. Duncan.
Hello, I'm Duncan Hames, the Director of Policy at Transparency International UK.
Hi, I'm Lara, Parizotto, Executive Director at Migrant Democracy Project.
Peter Stanyon, Chief Executive of the Association of Electoral Administrators.
And Dr. Parth Patel, Associate Director for Democracy and Politics at the IPPR.
Good morning. Elections always in the news, right? And it seems like a long time ago, July 2024, but elections and so many elections have continued to happen in last year and this year as well. There'll be many elections. You may recall at the last survey looking at public attitude to elections, so many people felt unhappy with the way elections are run in this country. A lot of people responded to the fact that they felt that misinformation online. Some people commented on how easy it was to vote and partake in elections. Obviously, a number of changes contained in the Elections Act 2022 around postal votes, around voter ID, around how many postal votes you can submit on behalf of people. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being extremely healthy and 1 not being healthy, how healthy would you say the state of the UK's democracy is right now? Duncan, no pressure.
Thank you, Chair. I'd give you a low number because we're here to sound the alarm today.
Okay.
A central premise of democracy is equality of voice. And the role of money in politics distorts that and is increasingly distorting it in very extreme ways. And you only have to look across the Atlantic as what is happening. Only last weekend the world's richest man closed down the largest humanitarian effort in the world, and no one ever voted for him. So we need to ask ourselves: are we going to sit around and see whether that could happen here? Are we going to make sure that actually our elections are one in which people do have equal voice? Our research found that the cost of elections has been rising, costing up to £100 million for a major party in a major election cycle, not least because last year the election campaign spending limits were increased by around 50% for the first time in a while. But shockingly, so much of the money that the political parties rely on comes from so few people. In 2003, £85 million in private donations. 2/3 of that came from just 19 donors, 19 people, 2/3 of the private donations in British politics. There was a similar pattern at the time of the EU referendum. The very small number of people, I think it was about 10 on each side of the argument, being sufficient for their donations to cover the whole of the regulated, permitted spending amount. And unfortunately, what we also see is those that give a lot of money are recognised in such a fashion that they might have a reasonable expectation of that. We found that in the last 20 years, nearly £50 million had come from donors who were alleged to have secured privileged access or influence or honours. Indeed, there are as many major party donors giving over £100,000 in the House of Lords as there are bishops. If you've got the big party donors to sit together, to some extent they do sit together in the House of Lords, it would be a bigger group in the second chamber of our Parliament. So big money is very much here in British politics, and it's an affront to that premise that democracy is something in which we all have an equal voice.
Lara.
I unfortunately also have to give it a 1 because we're talking about residents that have no right to vote at all. We're talking about 4.4 million residents, your own constituents who are coming to your surgeries for immigration casework, transport, housing support, and are not having any say over who represents them. We cannot consider it a healthy democracy when there are millions of people who are not able to have a say, to represent themselves, to inform their own interests. We cannot consider it a healthy democracy when those migrant residents that do have the right to vote, Commonwealth and EU citizens, are not voting nearly as much as their UK counterparts because of lack of information, lack of support, lack of awareness. And the government's response in the Elections Act has been to further disenfranchise EU citizens from their right to vote. So 171,000 EU citizens have been removed from the right to vote with the Elections Act. And that was really clear during the general election when EU citizens were so confused about whether they could vote or couldn't vote. And we've spoken to many of you often who are not super aware of which citizens in their own constituencies can continue voting or not. And it cannot be considered democratic because the point of democracy is that it's equal for everyone, it's participatory, that those that live, work, pay taxes, contribute to public services are able to have a say over their future. And that's simply not happening for millions of people who live in the UK, who make part of the UK. This is 16% of the UK population, 10 million born abroad. So these are a huge number of us who are our neighbours, who are often here, even in the House of Commons, who have naturalised as British citizens, but that democratic participation is simply locked away from too many of our residents.
Peter.
Just a wild question. I come from a slightly different angle. I would say in terms of the delivery of the elections, a 9 or a 10, because you can't knock the system in terms of those who are trying to deliver. I think they delivered against all odds. If you're talking about the actual system itself, then I think it's just 2, 3, 4, somewhere in that sort of region. The reason being is that, as all members will know, the current legislation is based on the 1872 Ballot Act and hasn't really changed. You know, there's a piece of paper and a pencil in the polling station, which works, but is not necessarily conducive with modern society, where many administrators, many returning officers have received an awful lot of criticism for not getting postal votes out the day following the application coming in, when in fact that's often because the applications are made before the close of nominations. There's a misunderstandings around the way the system actually works. So I think in terms of where we're at, that act and the changes to the way people engage with the modern way we deal with most things that we do now, so I would call it the Amazon culture type of thing, nothing wrong with that, but that does not apply to elections. But within the boundaries that administrators work, I think the biggest story was there was no massive story about the election falling over. It was about the election results, and that has got to be seen as a positive in terms of that boundary. But the legislation needs looking at, definitely.
I mean, I think it's difficult to conclude anything, but the health of electoral democracy in the UK is in pretty bad shape, and I can say that with confidence because it's really easy to tell. Turnout patterns in elections are one of the best barometers we have of social and collective well-being, because elections are basically the points at which we collectively express a desired future en masse. And it's that mass dimension that matters most. It's the mass dimension that separates voting from all other forms of political activity. It's the mass dimension that is receding. 1 in 2 adults living in this country voted at last year's general election. That's the lowest share of the population since universal suffrage, since women were given the right to vote. I think that should be setting off many more alarm bells than it currently is. It's surely one of the big questions of our times. Where did all the voters go? We're getting awfully close to that tipping point where elections lose legitimacy because the majority did not take part. And that's quite a dangerous place to be, and I can say that again because we can see signs and symptoms of that. Just months after last year's election, there was a petition to rerun it. It's easy to be flippant about that, but 3 million people signed that. That's more than 10% of people who actually cast a vote. You know, and we look at the US, Duncan mentioned the US, we look at the election denial movement there and think, that can't really happen here. But the ground beneath your feet can actually fall through much quicker than you think, especially when so many people have lost faith in the idea that the future is susceptible to human influence. That's the entire premise of democratic politics.
And I think all of you have touched on some of the challenges that we are facing with democracy. Obviously, there's issues around funding, there's issues around participation, there's issues around access. there's issue around who can vote. How confident are you that the government's actually taken the health of democracy and elections seriously, or is this, I think you touched on it, Peter, more people focused on the majority of the government as to actually how many people participated in the election?
Difficult to answer in terms of we're still very early into the term of office. The Law Commission's published their report on electoral reform several years ago now, and nothing's moved forward on that side. That's not to say there's been certainly some positive noises coming out with regards to trying to look at some of the more mundane issues within elections, and say maybe things such as timetabling, and certainly there are lots of recommendations coming. I'm sure the Electoral Commission later will come forward on some of their recommendations too in that sort of area. I think, however, it's reaching, leaning on from what Parth has said, it's reaching the point where we almost need to stand back and look at it as what are we trying to deliver in terms of, as I say, I'll go back to the point, we've got 80% of what we do now was written in 1872, and we've sedimentary put things on top of that, and there's been a lot of unintended consequences. There are issues with postal voting, for example, well documented in Scotland, partly because of the short timetables, partly because of the reliance on suppliers and the supply chain, partly on the reliance of raw mail in those things. So there are lots of things around the edges that actually maybe the time has come for just a stand back from what we're trying to achieve, rather than tinkering around the edges with what we've currently got because of those changes that have already come into the system.
Duncan.
Thank you. Well, governments of all political stripes now have yet to act on the recommendations on the Committee on Standards in Public Life on this issue back in 2011, which called for a cap on political donations of £10,000 annually from permitted donors. And also had recommendations around how one might address issues around company donations, which perhaps we can come on to. But at least this government, which is in its early days, maybe we should reserve judgment for now, has a commitment in its manifesto to strengthen the controls around donations. Yeah, I think the case that we would make is, whilst there are lots of small changes that you can make that try and strengthen the existing controls, fundamentally, if your system works on the basis that some people are allowed to have disproportionate influence over elections, as long as they're the right sort of people, you are going to struggle to make those controls work.
I can assure you there was a really good shadow minister for democracy who made sure those changes were in the manifesto. Lara, what reforms do you think we should see in electoral law, both sort of in the short term and the long term, to essentially improve the integrity of elections?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Scotland and Wales have extended the franchise to 16-year-olds and also to qualifying foreign nationals, judging on the basis of lawful immigration status. So there is a system that is working within the UK that can be done in England and Northern Ireland as well. And in terms of how is the government responding to this, the fact that societies, countries, polities are becoming more and more diverse, more and more international. Other countries like New Zealand have extended the franchise to every resident after 12 months of residence. So many other countries across the world are adapting to modern societies that have immigration, that have a globalized population. With the Elections Act in particular, what was done was to remove voting rights of EU citizens, and now we have 3 tiers of EU citizens with different levels of voting rights. So you have EU citizens who arrived in the UK by the 31st of December 2020 and have secured some form of lawful status, that have the right to vote in local elections. Then you have EU citizens who arrived in the UK from 2021 onwards, who will only have the right to vote if their country of origin has secured a bilateral voting rights agreement with the UK. And so far, it's only Poland, Luxembourg, Denmark, Spain, and Portugal that have secured those bilateral voting rights agreements. And then there's a third category, that if you're an EU citizen who arrived in the UK from 2021 onwards and you're not from one of those countries, you will not have the right to vote in local elections. So we've seen the confusion in practice in many elections where people are just not aware if they can and cannot vote. We've seen that from politicians, councillors as well, who are struggling to communicate that to their residents. So the response to further disenfranchise residents to us is really problematic. And within that Elections Act is the pursuit of bilateral agreements with other EU countries. But again, there's always going to continue having some citizens, some residents who are going to fall out through the gaps and are not going to benefit from those bilateral agreements.
I'm sure we'll come back to some of these points later on. Just moving on to transparency and funding, Joe.
Thank you, Chair. So if I could start with Duncan, just to try and get a sense of the scale of the challenge. How, currently, what do we know and what do we not know about where money is coming from to political parties?
There are two particular avenues whereby money can reach political parties and we cannot know who it has come from. One is through unincorporated associations. Since 2010, unincorporated associations have given over £40 million in political contributions. 95% of that has come from unincorporated associations that have not reported the source of their income. That's quite a lot of money to have entered British politics to not know whose money it was, or indeed, therefore, whether those were people who were allowed to give money to British political parties in their own personal capacity. The other route is company donations. And the PAPIRA legislation, which is quite old now, was drafted with this sense that companies were a separate legal personality with a stake in the future of the country that perhaps ought to be allowed to make political donations. But in practice, what we see in the pattern of company donations is these are privately held companies who are making political donations essentially on behalf of their owners. And although this is seen to be a lawful practice, in many respects it is not very different from the channeling provisions which are prohibited, right? I cannot give your money to a British political party regardless of whether you're allowed to do it yourself personally. But if you set up a company and you put money into that company can give money to a British political party. Sometimes the ownership structures, not even just the ownership, but the pattern of the transactions can make it very hard to be sure exactly where that money has come from. And it is, the back door is wide open to individuals who are not permitted to make donations to British political parties to use companies as a vehicle by which they could get round that rule.
So just on the first category, on unincorporated associations, is there anything that would stop us requiring the permissibility checks that are required of donations that come regularly to political parties for unincorporated associations?
No, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't make that requirement and indeed reduce the level at which unincorporated associations report their source of income of the order of £500 in a similar manner that one might make on individual donations. You could still have unincorporated associations making donations in that basis. It would just no longer provide this shield of anonymity around those that have put money into them.
But at the moment, you could be a foreign billionaire and put money through an unincorporated association, and there'd be no requirement to report who that person is or to check whether they're a permissible donor.
So for 95% of unincorporated associations, that has been the case, that they have not declared the source of that income, and the thresholds at which they end up doing checks are far too high for that to have caused that to be an obstacle to getting significant amounts of money into British politics.
And then on companies, and I'll ask, but on companies specifically, you referenced the kind of, if you like, the idea that they had a British personality, a stake in the British economy. I think one of the proposals that has been suggested is you could tie the amount a company could donate to their British activity, whether that's profit in the UK or some other measure. Do you think that that would be something that could prevent that loophole of kind of setting up a company purely for the purposes of bringing foreign money in?
Well, we have certainly recommended that would be a modest change that one could make to try and address this particular risk. I mean, in the work that we do on anti-corruption and money laundering, we find that there are any number of ways to game rules which are designed to put restrictions on the way companies operate. So one could certainly try, but my sense is that ultimately, without material donation caps, companies maybe with a five owners between them, people co-owning a group of people owning a company, multiple companies with unclear who the person in significant control of that company is, that there would be many ways in which one perhaps might still be able to game that system, so long as we maintain a situation in this country where there is no limit to the amount that any individual can give.
So just my final question for anyone is, so firstly, if you were to have a cap, I'm interested in views on whether there should be a cap, but if you were to have a cap, you would need some of these transparency measures to implement it, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't know necessarily where the money was coming from. So I guess that's for you, Duncan, then if anyone else wants to address the cap.
Yes, absolutely. That was recognised by the Committee on Standards of Public Life in 2011, where they wanted to know the owner of the companies that were making donations. So, yes, I don't think it's a case of either or. I think the needs of the moment, as demonstrated not just in America, but there are many democracies in which wealthy individuals essentially seek to control democratic outcomes. Require belt and braces approach.
Can I just quickly build on that? I completely agree with what Duncan says. I think you need both sets of measures because there are two problems in UK political finance. One is about the source of the funding and the other one is about the size of the funding. And I think we shouldn't really kid ourselves that undue influence can only come from beyond our borders. And if we fix the foreign interference problem, political financing in the UK is in a good place because it's not. There are sort of concerning trends in patterns of political donations over the past 20 years. The volume of money in British politics has grown. It's doubled in real terms since 2000. But more worryingly, it's become more concentrated. So the share of political financing in the UK that's coming from super donors, people giving more than £100,000, has grown and is growing quickly, actually. That comes with heightened risks of undue influence. That comes with heightened risks of corruption. And it affects public perceptions. It affects public perceptions and public behaviour. There's emerging evidence linking rising concentration and volume of money in British politics to low voter turnout, to distrust of the political system. And if we all agree, which I'm sure we do, that this is one of the main challenges of our time, then doing something about the volume and concentration of funding in British politics is a good idea. And that's where caps can come in. They help not only with the foreign interference problem, but they also help you with the concentration problem. And the last thing that's worth saying on that is that the UK is somewhat of an outlier relative to other European democracies. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Belgium all have political donation caps. And it's quite popular with the public too, including with most reform voters. And that's worth bearing in mind.
But would you not say that the public would also take umbrage in terms of having to fund political parties and political donations? So, in essence, political parties will argue, well, where will they get that money from?
Yeah, and that depends on where you set the cap, and this is probably where me and Duncan might disagree. The IPPR view is to set the cap at £100,000. Other expert bodies have suggested a much lower cap of £10,000. If you set the cap at that level, you will need alternative sources of party financing. If you set the cap higher, you don't have to answer that question right now. You can answer that question later. You can put in the higher cap, reduce the risk of corruption now, and start a cross-party conversation on how to get alternative sources of party funding.
Quickly.
On your point, Chair, if you reduce the spending limits, reverse the increase that happened last year, reduce them down to 16 million as a national spending limit in line with the Committee on Standards in Public Life recommendations, then then that would help the political parties deal with the question that you present. Because the principal challenge they face is not just how much they can spend, but how much their opponents can spend. It's an arms race. And if everyone has some restraint imposed on them in terms of this arms race, then it will help all politicians of all political parties break their dependency on these very, very large individual donors.
Thank you. Just moving on to foreign interference in UK elections, and hopefully our colleague will not be sanctioned after this
Thank you,
section.
which is why you chose me to do this question. Foreign political donations are banned in the UK, but it's possible for foreign money to enter UK politics. That is the House of Commons library. That isn't a conspiracy theorist. The fact that we have that rule, but there are huge loopholes, I think is concerning. So I'd welcome your thoughts on the impact those huge loopholes are having and what should be done about it, and then trying to broaden it just not to be about money. But how serious do you think the foreign interference is in elections in the UK?
Peter, Parth, Lara?
I think one of the challenges we have is that it's become increasingly hard for the Electoral Commission to enforce the rules that we do have. The maximum fine that they can impose is, I think, now £20,000, which doesn't really compare with the current numbers we've been using earlier on in this session. They were stripped of the power in recent legislation to mount criminal prosecutions. I think I could privately mount a criminal prosecution, but the Electoral Commission isn't allowed to, which is perverse. And certainly where the police, who are pretty busy with lots of other forms of crime, don't seek to bring criminal prosecutions under the law, having an independent body like the Electoral Commission able to do so would be very helpful. And they lost an important part of their independence. It was a very powerful signal when the requirement was introduced that there should be a strategy and policy statement for the Commission published by a government minister. It really doesn't live up to international standards. You see that sort of thing happen in other countries, and you start to question the independence of their electoral regulatory body. If we want to be able to mount proper defences, we do need the watchdog to have the independence to do that. They and others have looked at cases where it has appeared that foreign money has come into British politics, and they have, as far as we can see, been unable to do anything about it. There was a case where a bank raised a suspicious transaction report because it could see the connections to Russian bank accounts of a major donor to a British political party. He gave nearly £500,000 to a British political party within weeks of receiving several millions from his Russian father-in-law. There are other instances, sadly. We have a major donor recently who had served as a minister in the dictatorship in Mubarak's dictatorship in Egypt. We have the interesting case of the donations made by Aquind Limited, which initially everyone assumed were essentially donations coming from the party supporting director of that company, who gave interviews about how, as a supporter, what he wanted to see from the future leadership of the party that he'd been donating to. But it was only subsequently going through the records that we were able to find that the owner of that company was a dual national, British-Russian dual national, who had made his money from Caspian oil pipelines. So I think the House of Commons Library are quite right to say that one way or another, money that has essentially been earned overseas by overseas actors has ended up making its way into the campaign funds of British political parties. And we haven't been able to do enough to stop it.
I'll be brief to not repeat too much, but I mean there's agreement among most experts, not just the House of Commons Library, it's this committee a few years ago, it's the colleagues behind me, that UK political finance is vulnerable to foreign influence, and that is within the letter of the law, if not the spirit of the law. It feels like a relative no-brainer for us to act on that. Many of the ways we can do that have been mentioned already, but some of the other ones are you can apply a know your donor policy onto political parties, ban corporations from donating anything beyond their UK generated revenues or profits. You can put the due diligence checks on unincorporated associations. These things are all quite easy to do, and we should wonder why we haven't done them. I will just re-emphasise my point that we shouldn't kid ourselves that this is the only problem with UK political financing. Public contractors is a good example. It was very prominent during the pandemic about how procurement contracts were given to donors to the party that was in charge of the British state at that point in time. So there's another point of conflict of interest. The US is not held up as a gold standard for political financing, but even they ban public contractors from donating to political parties from the period at which negotiations start to the period at which the contract is completed. And if you look at people getting public contracts in the UK at the moment, there's quite a high share of them that donate to political parties.
Luke, you wanted to come in quickly?
Yeah, just a very brief point and open question. We've heard about how foreign citizens living here are unable to vote, yet the system is set up that foreign citizens not living here are able to donate massive amounts of money to influence the process. Does this seem particularly perverse and contradictory to you?
Yeah, absolutely. The people that I'm talking about, the residents that we meet on a day-to-day basis when we're out doing voter registration drives, are ordinary citizens, residents of the UK who have been, one case, a Brazilian man who works as an Uber driver. He's been here for 18 years. He has indefinite leave to remain, but he's just not prepared to pay the almost £2,000 fee to become a naturalised British citizen. And we shouldn't ask that from him because he has been here. He has an interest in the school that he takes his kids to, in the state of the roads that he drives on. He is probably like a key worker during the pandemic, but is not being able to have any say. And I think it's perverse on your side as MPs as well, because you are seeing these residents come to your surgery on a weekly basis, receiving their casework, and in turn they can't vote for you or vote for someone else. Sorry to pick on you, Mr. Powell, but you came first on our research of the highest number of unenfranchised residents, with 32,000 residents without the right to vote. And I don't work in your office, but I can expect... Right, yes. But I can expect there's a really high number of casework, both on immigration and in many other cases that I'm sure you're doing a really great job, but those residents are still unenfranchised and without the power to either thank you or find other alternatives.
Yeah. Lewis, you wanted to come in quickly?
Yes, so in the scenario you've just given us, so he can get the right to vote if he becomes a British citizen, is that correct? So in effect, you're misleading us a bit because it's his choice. So there is a choice available to him. If he wants to become a British citizen and get the privilege to vote, he can do that. He's choosing not to do that.
I would say it's not a choice when the cost of British citizenship is £1,600 just for the application fee itself, amounting to over £2,000 if you consider all other legal fees. But I'll take that point. However, there are many nationalities across the world that do not allow dual nationality. So, for example, a Japanese resident here in the UK, again, with indefinite leave to remain, would have to make a really tough choice of abandoning their nationality of origin to vote in their country where they live, where they reside, because very likely they still have ties to their country of birth, but they've made their home in here. Compared to myself, when I moved to the UK, I immediately got to vote at least in local elections because I had an EU citizenship. So I think that the question of choice, we can argue whether it is a real choice when the cost is so high and some people are actually locked out of that choice.
We're going to move on to voter engagement.
You do agree, though, that becoming a British citizen is a real privilege?
So I become a British citizen. I applied for my UK naturalisation and now have a British passport. I chose to do that because I actually really wanted to vote. Voting for me is really important. But I would argue from a personal perspective that choosing to become a British citizen should be much bigger, should be much more about cultural belonging rather than just wanting to have a right to vote. When a Commonwealth citizen counterpart that, just like me, decided to come to the UK, has been able to vote in general elections from day one of arrival.
Thank you. Sarah?
So you've obviously all expressed that deep concern that you have about the apathy and disengagement from the democratic process that we are currently witnessing. I'd want to just ask why it is that you understand people feel so disengaged, and that's open to anybody that wants to.
Again.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, sure, I'll go. I think from our experience is so much lack of awareness of voting rights. So we do regular voter registration drives where we go, for example, to a festival, a cultural festival. And when we're talking to Commonwealth or EU citizens, they simply do not know that they have that right to vote. And even when we're pulling up the gov.uk page that shows them that they have the right to vote, they're still doubting that because so little is done to promote that right to vote for them. And during the general election, because of all of these changes that I mentioned earlier about some EU citizens being removed from the right to vote, there were very contradictory messages on who had the right to vote. So we came across some influencers on Instagram and other social media platforms that were saying, EU citizens, you can now vote in general elections. And that information was passed on to people with followers of over 20,000. And we had to message them and ask them to please correct that because it wasn't true and they were giving misleading information. But it wasn't their fault, because if you went on the gov.uk register to vote page before the general election, it said the general election is on the 4th of July, this is who can register to vote. And on that list, it includes British, Irish, Commonwealth citizens, EU citizens that arrived in the UK before 2020, and those EU citizens that are from one of those countries that have bilateral voting rights agreement. So when you're just looking at the register to vote page, you understand that you have the right to vote. And if the top of the message says that the election is happening soon and this is who can register to vote, you're almost understanding that you can, because registering to vote is one right and then voting is another. So there was a lot of contradictory messages around that. And I think that leads to that statistic that 66% of EU and Commonwealth citizens are registered to vote, compared to almost 90% of British and Irish, because of that lack of information, lack of understanding. Of course, form, the gov.uk form not being translated, so we relies on civic society organisations like ours to put a lot of effort and money onto translating materials and going to churches, mosques and other events to get that information out there.
I might give a slightly different answer. I mean, this is a big question. There are books and books written on this, so trying to think about what I want to pull out. I mean, like all wicked problems, the causes here are multiple and complicated. But if I have to say just one thing, low voter engagement to a large extent reflects alienation from organised politics. And, I mean, to be frank, you all know this better than most people because you're on the other end of the ledger here. You know, you're actually, in a way, the experts on this. You're elected politicians. You feel and see the anti-politics mood of the times up close every single day, and you know it's an actual anger. You know, the distinguishing political mood of the times is more angry than it is apathetic. And we know that's empirically true. There's heaps of survey items. People like me have no say in what government does, is rocketing. People like me think it's not worth voting, is rocketing. And there's disparities here between top and bottom third of the income distribution, between people who have been to university and people who haven't been to university. There are broadly two ways in which I think about what's underlying this. There's the individuals, and what is it about individuals that make them not really want to engage with the political system. And then there's the political system and what's changed in the political system that's alienated people from organised politics, because it's easy to forget it didn't always used to be this way. On the individual side, it's along the lines of what Lara was saying. It's about awareness, it's about education, it's about social and economic backgrounds, it's about getting time off work. All of these reasons are the classic reasons, and we do sometimes actually over-focus on them, so I won't say enough about them. They are very important, and some of them are very easy to fix. But there are changes in the political system that have alienated people from organised politics over the past 30 to 40 years. They include the withdrawal of parties from civil society, the convergence of the mainstream parties on policy issues, the decline of working class MPs, the unresponsiveness or the unequal responsiveness of government policy, high-profile scandal and corruption, the rising role of money in politics. The list goes on. These are things that we can correct to some extent. We're not going to fix the issue. It's the 30 to 40 years in the making. The problem right now is the trend is still going in the wrong direction. And in this Parliament, you can take steps to at least reverse that trend. And I feel like that should be the target of government policy.
Duncan, you wanted to come in, sorry.
I just wanted to come back quickly before, just to say, and to what extent do you think also, you didn't mention the role of social media and how that's part of the picture that we now find ourselves in, and also to what extent the impact of trade unions and linked to that, the issue around working class MPs are just.
Yeah. I mean, these are big questions. The way in which people relate to one another and then relate to the political system that's about collective governance has completely changed. And to be frank, I don't think we've completely understood that, and therefore policy hasn't really come to terms with that reality. The evidence is much clearer on the role of civic organisations like unions and churches, and what that does to mobilise people into politics in terms of their own psychology, but also their political behaviour. The evidence on how new media and information systems are affecting perceptions of democracy and what democracy means is much thinner. I think that's an active research question, one that we're looking at right now, but clearly it's important how we work within that new information system to try and rebuild engagement in democracy is a really tough question. I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer to that right now.
I'll come to Duncan quickly.
Thank you. On your question about why trust is so low, my bad news for you, to some extent speaking from experience as a former Member of Parliament, is that you're not judged by the public on your conduct alone. They judge the political class as a whole. And so effectively you're not just judged for what you do, you could be trying your best to behave in an upright manner and supporting good democratic practice. But you're judged on what you let others, or what you're seen to let others get away with. Especially when they're your own colleagues, but not even just your own colleagues, just as the way politics operates in this country. And so I would urge you to consider that it's not enough for your own political party or your own parliamentary local office to get your house in order. You need to persuade your colleagues across the House, or to sufficient of you to act in good number to address the issues that we've discussed today. Otherwise, the status of democratic politics in this country will still be held in disdain by many people who frankly, the surveys say they do assume that those with more money carry more influence in what is supposed to be decisions made in the public interest.
I know some people believe that.
Sarah, was there any more?
I thought were you bringing in? I was going to do one more, but
quickly.
So just wanted to move to how you think we can improve levels of voter registration specifically and broader democratic engagement, particularly about amongst those who are less likely to register. But as we hear, actually it's across the board question now, I'll leave it open to your.
On voter registration, introducing a form of automatic or assisted registration is the way forward. Again, the UK is very clearly an outlier here. I can't think of another liberal democracy that takes a laissez-faire approach to voter registration the same way we do. Automatic registration is very common in European democracies, most European democracies. I think there's about 30 democracies in Europe that do it. And assisted voter registration is common in the Anglophone countries. That's America, Australia, Canada. We don't do either of those things. There's no good reason that we don't do it, because it's not that difficult to do. Automatic voter registration is fast-acting and high impact. And there are different ways in which you can think about it. Some are more complicated than others. But at the moment, we have a system where you have local electoral offices in local government. And one way you can do is to give them more information sharing powers, so they can automatically register people themselves. Instead of someone having to write, saying, I want to register, they write to the person saying, can I register you? Or I'm going to register you, opt out if you want, or go anonymous if you want. That's very easy to do. That's being piloted in Wales right now. The Electoral Commission colleagues behind me might be able to tell you a little bit more about the implementation, but that is something I would urge this Parliament and this government to try and implement ahead of the next election.
I think it comes back down to the fundamental way that we register people to vote. We've had significant changes over the last few years, certainly in my career. It used to be household registration. We used to have the canvass, the head of household registered people. The canvass now doesn't do that. It just audits and it invites people to register. That was a fundamental decision made in the change by Parliament in terms of this is the way we want to do this. So things like AVR and the other systems, we need to understand what it is that we're trying to fix and what's the best method of doing that. Data sharing, absolutely. There are massive databases that electoral officers do not have access to. It's very much a locally based thing, but we don't have access to DVLA. There is data matching to DWP and things like that, but there's somebody there who should be on the electoral register. I also think, going back to your earlier point about social media and just general media reporting, fortunately, unfortunately, I think it's unfortunately, there's a great emphasis on Parliament, a great emphasis that every 5 years there'll be a general election. Let's focus everything on that. Every Thursday, across the country, there's an election taking place, whether it be a parish election, and we've got the discussions now about local government reorganisation to contend with. The whole issue around communications, colleagues on the panel have got far more experience and expertise in their areas, but across the board, it's about raising that awareness that actually voter registration is now, and then when the election's called, you can vote if you wish to do so. And I think we've gone away from that. Certainly statistics that have come out of the last few national polls suggest we're moving to event-led registration rather than it being the normal process. And that's because when individual electoral registration came into being, in the first 3 years of that, there were 3 major national events taking place and the registration levels were very high. I think we're now dropping down to the level of where there is that disengagement for whatever reason that might well be. So I think, it's a step back thing. Let's see what we're trying to fix and get the right system in place, because automatic voter registration is a sliding scale of providing data or putting people on the register, and somewhere in between is where we need to sort of consider where we need to.
And I think just on that, Peter, just recognising the work that you and your colleagues do on a weekly basis, and the electoral administration is making sure elections function and we have a functioning, transparent democracy. So we do thank you for that. We're just going to move on swiftly. Luke and Chris are going to ask some stuff around voting reforms.
Voting reforms, Democrat questions. Strap in. Okay, so I'm going to start with some numbers. I'm going to use 7 adults sitting on that side of the panel as an illustration here. So in 2023-2024, there are about 68 million adults in the UK, of which there were 50 million who were eligible to vote. So of the 7 people over there, only 5 were eligible to vote in the last general election, of which only 28 million chose to vote. So already we're down to 3 of the adults on that side of the table actually decided to go out and vote, of which 9.7 million voted for Labour. So we're down to Joe is our single Labour voter out of those 7 adults, representing all the adults in our country, which resulted in 63% of seats and a crushing majority for Joe. Is that a functioning electoral system?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I'm going to say whatever system's in place, we will administer it. So
I'm going to interpret that as a question about the voting system. I think that's what you were getting at.
First past the post.
The first past the post system. I mean, again, we're not going to have time to have a proper debate on this. This is an issue that has periodic revivals in British political history. The prospects currently are just very low. You're right, Labour won a historic majority on an extremely efficient or an extremely disproportionate distribution of votes, right, depending on which way you see it. Distribution is the key word there. The main thing about the first past the post system is that geography matters. Where you live determines how influential your vote is in any given election. Now, you can make an argument for that or an argument against that. That is the key difference. There are lots of instrumental differences between majoritarian and proportional systems, effects on public attitude, perceptions of political efficacy, voter turnout levels, the stability of policy. All of those things are, the evidence says, sort of better, basically, in proportional systems compared to winner-takes-all systems. But the debate should be happening on the intrinsic level. Should it matter where you live? Should all votes be equal regardless of where you live or not? That is the question. That's not for me to answer, that's for you guys to answer.
Who wants to come back on that really quickly? Lara.
I'm not going to comment on first past the post, but still on reforms. There's the philosophical question of why are so many of those that have the right to vote not voting, and I think touching on Sarah's point as well, that for example there are over 1 million Romanian residents in the UK, but no Romanian MPs. And that point of seeing yourself in politics is really important to get people inspired and wanting to vote. And they're still staying on Romanian residents. There's single-digit Romanian councillors across the UK, and that really inspires you to participate in politics. But on the practical sides of voting, with the introduction of photo ID, One angle that we are concerned about is that a lot of migrants do have a form of photo ID. They either have the biometric residence permit cards or a passport that they often are asked to prove their immigration status. With the move to e-visas, however, many migrant residents are going to lose that physical proof of their ID. So there's the question of how are they going to continue voting in person if they don't have that photo ID with them anymore. So there's some contradictions in the system of immigration policy pursuing, for example, e-visa, whereas on democracy we're still asking people to take some form of physical proof of their ID to vote.
Luke, you good on that? Move on to.
Yeah, so I mean, it was a question about the electoral system, but and I'm not going to ask about recommendations because I think we could go into the weeds there. Peter, the work of the electoral administrators, and I think we touched on it in PACAC the other week, changing the voter system would obviously have a dramatic impact on how counts proceeded, how long it takes to declare results. Do you see challenges around that? Do you see public perception with the speed of results? Maybe we want to explore the impact of change on those issues.
First past the post is a simple system to count, as we all know. Sort and count. Very quick results can come out as a result of that. It's not the only system that has been used or is in use in the UK. And certainly STV system in Scotland, local government elections, had the old SV system, alternative vote system in London, for example, recently, which is obviously now gone back. First past the post. I think very much comes down to the practicalities of what's being delivered. If we're talking, say, take an STV system, that's incredibly complicated because of the sharing of the votes, and that may lend itself to electronic counting as it's done in Scotland. In Northern Ireland they don't. They actually count that by hand, and that takes 4 or 5 days sometimes. So in London, my experience of that, it was a reasonably straightforward system that had the 3 contests taking place at the same time, one of which was the proportional system. So I think the system, the administration of it will adapt to whatever the system actually is, and there will be a reality that says if it was STV, for example, that came in for a UK parliamentary election, the results will not be there at 2 o'clock on a Friday morning after the polling the day before. There will be that period. In terms of how voters will take to that, then that's just a communications issue about how the process actually works. So I think it's fair to say whatever system is approved will be administered as efficiently as it can be in the circumstances.
Chris.
Thank you. Just a few questions, if that's okay. Lara, firstly, you talked there about the impact that voter ID laws have had, or you expect to have on migrant communities. Firstly, do you think overall the introduction of voter ID has had a positive or negative impact on the participation of migrant communities in British politics? And secondly, do you think the Electoral Commission and the previous government have taken those kind of concerns seriously?
Thank you for that question. I think, as I said, there's a general fact that migrant communities are more likely to have some form of ID because they're asked for that all the time. But what we've heard when we're out with communities is, what if on the day of the election I have a pending immigration case and all my documents, because you have to send every original copy of your documents to the Home Office, and as you probably know, that can often stay with the Home Office for months. So again, there's elections every Thursday, so what if on the day of the election you don't have any form of ID with you? And yes, we promote voter authority certificates, but that's still a difficult message. So that on itself is something that's going to disproportionately affect migrant residents. And as I just mentioned, the move to e-visa is something that has just been postponed by the government, but we are concerned about when it comes into practice that people are simply not going to have their IDs to vote.
So you'd say negative?
Yeah.
And do you think that the previous government and the Electoral Commission took those concerns seriously?
We've not had a very thorough conversation on photo ID with the previous or this government. What we've been focusing on a lot is on the extension of the franchise, which I would say has not been taken seriously.
Thank you. Peter, in I think late 2022, your organisation put out a press release saying it's no longer realistic to successfully introduce voter ID in May 2023. A quote directly from you said, "We risk electors being deprived of their right to vote." Do you think the Electoral Commission in the previous government disagreed with you and thought you were wrong, or do you think they didn't care about electors being deprived of their right to vote?
That was at the time the voter ID was first coming in. It was a very constrained timescale that meant at that particular period the communication to staff in terms of understanding what they needed to do was taken on board. The Electoral Commission, I believe, are on the same page as us in terms of those risks and to the actual electoral process. Decision was taken by government to proceed. So administrators can only deliver what they can deliver at those elections.
I mean, we'll ask them in a little bit, but I don't believe they came out and ever made those comments publicly that they have those concerns, did they?
We felt at the time it was getting the speed of that introduction was potential to give risk to the process. That's why we came out publicly and had expressed our risk, our concerns that actually there was a significant chance of risk coming in. As it happened, nothing did happen. So, in terms of the safe delivery of those particular elections was.
Thank you for doing so. That is what I think many of us expect from independent organisations like yourself, and would expect from the Electoral Commission if they also had the concerns that you mentioned. Parth, we heard in our inquiry recently at PACAC that the Electoral Commission recommended these changes in 2014 because of risks of personification, despite the fact that there was little evidence of risks of personification, and this because they were worried that there was a public perception of personification happening, despite their evidence showing that that was very far down voters' priority lists for concerns about elections. Do you think that it was reasonable for the Electoral Commission to recommend bringing in voter ID in 2014, and do you agree with the logic that they used in making that recommendation?
No, so some of that is new information to me. I certainly can say this: I don't agree with the logic of that. Look, the aims of increasing the security of electoral processes and increasing voter confidence in those electoral processes is perfectly legitimate and should be pursued. But the introduction of voter ID as a means to that, to me, reflects a profound misunderstanding of where the threats are coming from, to put it plainly. And there are negative consequences of introducing voter ID. 2 million people didn't have acceptable ID at last year's general election. That's 5% of the electorate, according to the team behind the British election studies, quite an esteemed group of researchers. So whether you like it or not, the introduction of this policy has unintentionally caused voter suppression. We can debate the size of that suppression, but not the fact.
So, final question, if I may, Chair. Given that view, do you think it's given that view, and given how I think there's a lot of cynicism about a lot of the recommendations the Electoral Commission has made on this, how much trust do you think we should be giving to the Electoral Commission's current view on voter ID rules?
Well, I don't know what their current view is on voter ID rules, so I can't comment on that. The Electoral Commission, I think, is a body that does demand trust for elections to perform legitimately. And I'm of the view, I think, as Duncan is, that they should have more powers and much greater independence. I think the removal of their independence with the new statement that the last government did was a significant issue, and the paring back of some of their powers was a significant issue. But I'm not in a position to comment with expert views on the actual Electoral Commission as an institution itself, I'm afraid.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Just lastly, just mindful of time, colleagues, and responses from our guests. Looking at voting age, Maya.
So this government's obviously continually committed to introduce legislation to lower the voting age to age 16. Dr. Patel, I believe you just recently released a report sort of very much in support of that, saying that it would build a norm of democratic participation. So just the question to all of you is sort of what would the main impacts and opportunities be of lowering the voting age to 16?
Happy to say something that, as I said earlier, Scotland and Wales, when they extended the franchise, they did it together for 16-year-olds and for qualifying foreign nationals. And in their own impact assessment in Scotland, for example, for both those surveyed were in favour at about 79%. So I think if the government is to extend the right to vote to 16-year-olds, would be ideal to use that opportunity to also extend the franchise to every other resident that does not yet have the right to vote. We constantly meet families and 16-year-olds who may be from the US, Brazil, Ukraine, who will not be enfranchised either at the age of 16 or 18 and beyond if that is the case. And especially when you're in school and some of your colleagues will have that right to vote and you will not, something so big is going to happen to your friends and you're still going to be excluded from that can exacerbate social exclusion and not a good democracy for those in certain spaces.
I was going to say, sorry, from an administrative perspective, I think what we have to do is learn from Scotland and Wales. They've done it, so England shouldn't reinvent the wheel as far as that's concerned. A couple of areas that I think the committee would like to hear, I suppose, is really around the fact that the differences between the registration in Scotland and Wales to what's been proposed, there will still be some bits where they butt against each other. So it'd be helpful to get that consistency of one system that, respecting devolution, the fact that actually we're talking about 16, 17-year-olds being able to register. But I think the crucial bit is one, communication about the individual being able to, and let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's go down the lines of actually using the good practice that firstly Scotland, then Wales introduced when bringing this in. So it's a reasonably straightforward administrative process.
Yeah. I can be super brief. I mean, I can see very few reasons not to lower the voting age. I think all the arguments against it are essentially condescending opinions of 16 and 17-year-olds, and that doesn't stand up, to be honest. Our social norms already and our laws already allow these people to leave school, get a job, pay tax, get married, have a child. It's strange that we don't let them collectively express a desired future. I mean, in terms of the impacts, it will bring 1.5 million people into the franchise. So in the sort of the immediate term, that's like a small but significant increase. In the longer run, the impacts are probably more positive because of the thing you refer to. It sort of helps build a democratic culture, habituation. If you vote at 16, you're more likely to then vote at later ages. At least that's the evidence that's coming out of Scotland. It's slightly more complicated in Austria, but in Scotland that is what we're seeing. Greece and Malta also do it, so there's not too many countries. It's worth remembering the UK was one of the first countries, I think, to lower the voting age to 18, so there's something it can do by lowering it to 16 and leading sort of a movement on a global stage on that. And there's something, I guess this is the last point to end on, there is something strange happening at the moment with democracy and young people. I think we all know this. Yeah. The socialisation, the politicisation of young people has changed, right? We could say that. How it's changed, we don't know. But it doesn't look very optimistic. And for this government to go out and sort of lower the voting age, that would be quite a powerful move to try and say, okay, we're going to sort of do things a bit differently now.
Can I just ask one follow-up around that? Is that where do you think the discussion needs to sit about what we need to do alongside that in terms of whether it's education, whether it's community engagement? What needs to sit alongside that to make that a success in terms of voter engagement and kind of participation at that age?
I think it is really powerful to have that education still happening in schools. And speaking from my own personal life, is that when you're in school, when you're receiving information from teachers, you're the one as a migrant child that brings that information to your parents. We're not in spaces that are allowing themselves to build the democratic, political, civic knowledge. So extending the right to vote to 16-year-olds alongside extending it to all residents will be really powerful, because those newly enfranchised 16-year-olds from various countries will be able to give that information to their parents as well, and that will build democratic participation for everyone.
I think it is education in the correct form. And that goes back to the point I made earlier. Elections take place every Thursday. It's not just the once every 5 years. I'm afraid there's still that ethos that is the case. If we can get that ingrained into people's psyches, the potholes in roads are different to making law, for example, going forward. So that is really fundamental. But that is for the experts in education to be able to work alongside bodies such as the Commission in terms of what's the best language.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much to our guests this morning. Given us a lot of food for thought and something that I'm sure we'll continue conversations on. I'm just going to change guests now. Thank you. Running a bit behind, but we will make sure we get through the questions. Can I just ask our guests just to introduce themselves for the record, please? I'll start with Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Douglas. I'm Head of Regulatory Support.
I'm John Pullinger. I'm the Chair of the Commission.
Vijay, I'm the Chief Exec of the Electoral Commission.
Tom Hawthorn, Director of Policy and Research at the Commission.
Great, thank you very much. Going to start with Luke in terms of our questioning this morning.
Good morning and hello again. So I'm going to start off on echoing some of the questions we asked in the previous section, so around monitoring and regulating the financing of political parties and campaigning organisations, it's worth adding in the UK. So we heard in the previous section around some of the restrictions on what the Electoral Commission can do in terms of limits of fines, can't bring criminal prosecutions, and then limits on police time and effort to investigate. I guess, the question I've got written down here, which is quite a good way to frame it, is has the way that political parties have been funded and how that has changed in recent years made it difficult to oversee and to police, and how are you adapting to those changes?
The legal framework in which we're operating is out of date, overcomplicated and inconsistent, so that creates a big series of challenges for us. And I think political parties need to be commended for the effort they put in to comply with the transparency regime that's in place. And thanks to their efforts and the efforts of Laura's team here, we have very high levels of compliance with the regime. However, we have seen over the last 10 years or so quite dramatic drops in public confidence in the transparency of the political finance regime to very low levels. We see the whole system within which we're operating changing very rapidly, and there's a real need to future-proof the system for changes which are still very much in progress, and you've heard a lot of that from the previous panel. And we also have a series of weaknesses that were there at the beginning that really do now need to be addressed if we're not to face some even more damaging consequences for public trust in the system. And that seems to me, or seems to us, to be the key metric that we should think about. If you like, I'll invite Vijay just to say a little bit more about some of the reforms we think we should put in place now to address some of those issues. But that's the kind of opening point, which is yes to your question.
Thank you very much, Chair. As John said, public agreement that spending and funding of parties is transparent has fallen from 37% in 2011. It's now down at about 15%. So that really is a significant issue in terms of public trust, whereas trust in other parts of the system is quite high. That one is going down. We've made, and have been making for a long time, 3 core recommendations since about 2013. I think you heard about these from your previous guests. The first is on company donations, that it should only be able, a company doing business in the UK, as is currently the case, should only be able to donate as much as its profits, essentially, over the last year or so. That would have a significant effect, and we've been suggesting that, I say, for a long time. The second is on unincorporated associations, which are possibly even worse a problem than your previous guest set out. Any 2 foreign nationals or more abroad could set up an unincorporated association in the UK, and by law they are a permissible donor at that point. The transparency requirements on them are really very low. We do not have to publish, and they do not have to make public, the name of the person who's responsible and directing, and they don't have to be permissible donors themselves, those who are donating in. So there's a number of things on unincorporated associations that we do think need to be changed in the law, and this is primary legislation, to bring them under the same kind of controls as other donors and the same kind of transparency as other donors. And finally, again, your previous guest touched on this, the Know Your Donor checks by political parties who do a good job in trying to check what they can. There is more they can do, and there is more that we probably need to do to look a little bit behind some of the donors coming through. We have the agency or other requirements where you can't donate through someone else, but it's great if the parties themselves can build their capability in checking who their donors are and asking the question when they have any concerns. So those are our 3 main recommendations, which we think won't completely make the system perfect, but they would fix some of the significant issues that we have seen and your previous guest have pointed out.
Can I just take advantage and congratulate all of the various party treasurers, local party treasurers and agents around the country for the incredible work they do in complying with...
Keeping us out of prison, Luke.
Well, exactly, yeah. Although their frequency of declaring us as the legal necessities in the process is slightly disappointing. It does take the sheen off their achievement somewhat. But yeah, it's incredible the work they do and the abilities they have to comply with the rules that are very clearly set.
I couldn't agree more. We have been stepping up tremendously the amount of support that we give to parties. The main parties have good operations in place. We have now over 400 political parties in the UK, and one of the challenges of the system is, if you're one of the smaller parties, compliance with this is a real challenge. And so Laura's team in particular, and she wanted to say more, have been stepping up tremendously the support part of the enforcement. So we're not just trying to enforce after the event when someone breaches inadvertently maybe some of these complex laws, but help them to comply long before they have to actually produce what are very long and complicated returns, as you know.
Yeah, I'm going to just say briefly, we provide guidance and support for parties and campaigners, and we want to do that in a way and at a time that works for them. Our key objective is making sure that people understand their obligations, but also that they can campaign with confidence. At the most recent election, we had over 800 requests for support around filling in the candidate return, and we also want to make sure that those parties that don't have massive teams understand the law and are able to participate in our democracy. And we do this primarily through feedback that we get about how the law is applied in practice and make sure that's reflected in our guidance. And importantly, as I say, just provide that targeted advice and support.
Yeah, you've answered some of the follow-up questions, but I will just ask, and keep it brief, because of time. What specific changes do you need to see from the government to ensure the Electoral Commission is best able to ensure the integrity of political funding? So what changes? We've spoken about some of the problems.
That's just two. First of all, the ability to have fines proportionate to some of the more serious offences, and we don't. £20,000 doesn't necessarily make a dent in some of the people who are potentially committing these offences. We would also like a further set of data sharing powers. It's very, very complex at times to track the money, track some of the donations back through the various channels they have come. We work very closely with the police, with the NCA, with plenty of other agencies. The data sharing between us can be quite a challenge at times. So there's some data sharing powers that we'd also find very helpful.
If I may, Chair, just one other thing which is not so much about us but for the system. It's to deal with the horrendous inconsistency between the regime that candidates face, which is criminal for everything, and the regime that parties face, which is civil for anything. And that creates a huge jeopardy for you and your agents and for political parties. And that's something which I think would make the lives both of individual candidates and of parties much more straightforward if that was joined up.
Lee, very quickly.
Yeah, just on the fines, do you find there's a issue with recovering the fines once you've set it? Because if you take the unincorporated body example, 2 foreign nationals set up a unincorporated body, make a donation. If you fine them, how do you get the money back at the end?
So most of our fines, I think, have been on political parties rather than unincorporated associations, because under the law as it stands, an unincorporated association is a permissible donor, so they're able to do this. In general, no, we don't have a major problem, but we have at times had real problems in enforcing some of the fines. But in the end, it just takes a long time, and I think we had to go to civil recovery on a couple of occasions to do so.
Thank you. Nishala.
Thank you, Chair. So we heard from the previous panel in quite some detail about the potential influence of foreign individuals and organisations in UK elections, particularly around finance. And I know, Vijay, that you just referenced it there as well. But what are the main challenges that you face in monitoring and regulating the threat of interference from foreign nationals and organisations in UK elections?
I mean, clearly there's the financial one, which we've touched on, so that is quite significant. Separate to that, we were looking very closely before this general election at the social media sphere and the mis and disinformation that was flowing. We were looking at the abuse and intimidation, and we obviously published quite significantly. Some of that was clearly events outside, particularly in the Middle East, which immediately came back into the British domestic political sphere. And we were looking, and we were clearly worried about some of the influence of AI and how that would be used in some of the technologies. I don't think any of them were dominant or affected the election result. We gave a fairly positive assurance at the end of it. But they are clearly things we can't be complacent about. So we are concerned about the social media world and what we can do on that, particularly the changes to things like fact-checking. And we're working very closely with other regulators on how we can actually support candidates and the public to understand what is going on then. We didn't see evidence of, and we worked very closely with government on this, of major foreign hostile state activity. And that was good. Clearly it's another possibility. And so with the Defending Democracy Task Force, we're very plugged in to try to do whatever we can to support. And then finally, just on mis and disinformation, there were deep fakes. There was a significant amount of people saying they had seen mis and disinformation in our post-poll report. Where we came in was if we saw mis and disinformation about the electoral process, and there was some, we would try and contradict it very loudly and very clearly. Things like, you don't need to bring a voter ID. Yes, you do, and here's why and what you've got to do. And so we will take a very clear stand on that. Overall, therefore, it wasn't a massive feature of the election, but it's something that we're going to include in our next corporate plan, which will stand for the next 5 years, because we think, looking to elections around the world, this is an increasing set of challenges. I was on Teams call with my Australian colleague this morning, who needs to run an election before May, and they are really concerned by some of the challenges coming their way. So we're working with partner regulators around the world to see what are the challenges and what can we do about them.
Thank you. And just in terms of, obviously you've picked out a few things, the hostile states, the use of social media, do you think that the UK government is suitably equipped at this point and legislation is there in place to be able to deal with that going forward? And how can we close that gap? What more should we be doing for future elections?
Well, let me start, if I may. I mean, one thing we think is really important is for the electoral system to be seen as part of our critical national infrastructure. And with that kind of designation comes the full support of the state and the resources at its disposal. And we have had some very active and supportive engagement, as Vijay said, with the Defending Democracy Task Force and the various agencies that can get the intelligence to help us understand what's going on. But there is investment needed that we'll come to maybe later in this conversation. But it underpins the corporate plan which we'll be putting forward for the next 5 years at a whole series of levels. Our electoral system has been underinvested. And Peter Stanyon mentioned the electoral administrator point of this. I mean, the system is run on a shoestring, and yet it absolutely matters that it is run well for the success of democracy and the kind of health of our futures and the institutions that enable the state to function effectively. So that's the step up we think we need to see over the next few years.
Just one final question, going back to donations, and again I know, Vijay, that you did touch upon this in previous comments, but how urgent do you think it is that we close that gap, that the government takes action to close that gap, particularly for unincorporated associations and the potential threat of foreign donations that we might see?
We've been making that recommendation since 2013, so we'd very much like to see it in place as soon as possible. I don't think it's urgent in the sense of, it's got to be rushed through Parliament, but in the next piece of legislation, we're very much working with government on what those provisions could be. They are complex. They will need proper scrutiny and debate and consultation with the many people who would be affected, not least the parties, and we've been discussing this in the various political parties panels as well. But they have been a long time in gestation.
Joe, is there anything you wanted to add?
So just for clarity, so you feel like there is consensus on unincorporated associations, transparency over who is donating and requiring permissibility checks for as would be if they were a regular donor, so that is that right? Those would be the two things where you feel like.
Well, there's those two, and the restriction on company donations as well. I don't know whether there's consensus about that, but the recommendations we have made consistently, the Committee on Standards in Public Life has made consistently, and those arguments were put forward in debates, for example, around the National Security Act that came into force quite recently. So there's certainly a consistent line of argument put forward. But as Vijay said, if it comes before the House, it would need to be debated and scrutinised thoroughly and properly.
Thank you. Electoral reform, Chris.
Thanks. I'm going to focus on voter ID, unsurprisingly, or there's a few other bits of this section. So firstly, given the comments that were made by Mr Stanyon in the previous panel, I think he sort of implied that you may have shared some of the views that he was bringing up at the time on the change to voter ID laws. Do you think that was a fair characterisation? Do you think you made those views known, including publicly, at the time, and if not, why not?
Well,
as an organisation, not individuals, obviously.
My recollection is that we've been very clear publicly and with the government that the introduction of voter ID needs to meet 3 tests. The first is that it meets the test of providing assurance around security, which is where our initial report came in, but only if it met the test of accessibility. And I can recall the phrase that I certainly used in committees was one person turned away is one too many, and it's got to meet that test. And the third test is workability, and that's where Peter Stanyon's colleagues come in. It's got to be something that's introduced in time and in a manner that can be effectively administered. So our position now is there is still work to be done, and particularly around the accessibility test. Local authorities did a magnificent job in 2023 and then in 2024 of administering this effectively. We need to make sure they have the resources to continue to do that. But there were people turned away, and we need to take action to ensure that is minimised and ideally that no one is turned away. So there are three things we think need to happen. The first is the list needs to be expanded of acceptable forms of ID, and there are certain groups, so young people, there's the young people's Oyster card that could be included. Unemployed people were more likely to be discouraged from voting than others, so there's the DWP card that many of them have that could be made part of the list, expand the list. The second one, it was referenced in the earlier panel, was the voter authority certificate. That was a very clunky thing. Make that much more straightforward and ideally digital, so people can get it very easily.
Quite a low take-up of that, wasn't there?
Yeah, very low turnout. Yes, because it was clunky. And the third one, which would deal with the question of people having their documents away, and I recall witnessing at a polling station I went to someone in exactly that position. I was very impressed with the presiding officer trying to think of solutions, but the solution that we propose, which is the one adopted in Canada, is to allow vouching for people. If someone who is there knows that you are that person but you can't provide the documents, then that is possible. We believe with those three changes, voter ID can meet the three tests, as it has done now for 20 years in Northern Ireland.
That's a lot of work to do in order to fix a system which, as one of the previous panellists said, sort of is fixing a problem that didn't really exist in the first place. I think is not an unfair characterisation. And I think the reason I phrased the previous question in the way that I did is because what many of us through this process found interesting is we felt like the Electoral Commission was not acknowledging the problems that were being faced as we went through this process. So let me give you one example. On the night, please correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, but it's my best recollection, at 10 p.m-ish, straight after voter ID laws came out, the Electoral Commission put out a press release before any data had been collected, before anyone had done any work looking at the impact that had happened towards people turning people away. The Electoral Commission put out a press release saying that they thought the first elections for voter ID laws being brought in had been well run. Now that was widely interpreted by the press, as any comms professional would have told you, as being tacit support for the voter ID law changes and not challenging some of the problems that may have arisen from that before we'd have had any time to analyse whether those problems had come about. So I think what many of us find quite concerning is that the Electoral Commission wasn't performing its purpose properly and correctly challenging some of the issues that came along during that process.
Let me just explain, I think, a little the two things. One is a press release, you're absolutely right, 10 p.m. on the close of poll, which was looking at the entirety of the poll and how it had run. Had we seen long queues outside polling stations and people turned away because of the voter ID checking, that would have been a real problem. That was a problem we identified in advance, and with the AEA and other administrators, and local councils, we made sure that the polling stations were.
But you knew how that press release was going to be interpreted, right? Like you knew that press release was going to be interpreted as the big the big change that was made to our electoral system that way. That's gone fine with no problems. We didn't know that at the time.
And broadly, we saw what was going on in that day, and we had people in many of the counts and polling stations, and we thought that the implementation of voter ID in the polling stations, I said, did work broadly well. We then, of course, did a full-scale piece of work analysing what had happened, and we published that late last year in a standalone report on voter ID, doing, Mr. Kess, I think exactly what you're asking us to do, which is analyse the policy, go through all the numbers, and we did a major piece of public polling research as well to find out not just who was turned away at the polling station, but who was put off by the voter ID requirement. We then made a whole series of policy recommendations to try to improve it, which John has set out, so I won't repeat that. But I think there was a degree of assurance that we should have given on the night of the poll about the entirety of the poll. It wasn't really about voter ID specifically. It was saying, look, we've just been through quite a snap general election in the middle of holidays in parts of the UK, in quite a heated environment politically, which you all know as well as we do, and it worked well. Witness the fact that I think we had no challenges to the results, and we had a tremendous amount of, if I can put it, losers' consent exhibited that night, which is a fundamental part of our system. So I think I would stand by the fact that we think those elections were well run, and broadly did indeed reflect very much the will of the people who voted for them. But we do not minimise the fact that we should have come back, and we've made those recommendations on voter ID very specifically in the standalone report.
Yeah. Okay, final question from me. I'll try and word this. Over the time when these debates were happening, so let's say 2013 to 2024, was there any communication between the previous government and the Electoral Commission that any reasonable person would have considered as pressure being applied by the previous government in order to make the Commission, in its communications, more favourable towards the voter ID changes?
I would say absolutely no to that, certainly during my time. I've been in post for nearly 4 years now, and no.
Okay, but it'd be good to...
Had there been, we would have resisted it.
It'd be good to have confirmation that that was not the case over the entire period as well.
Well, I would be astonished if it were. I can only speak from my own experience here. Well, Tom, you were here at the time. Do you want to respond?
Absolutely not aware of that. And I think certainly while the elections bill was being debated and as it went through Parliament, we briefed Parliament on our views and concerns about some of the risks relating to the approach that the government was taking on voter ID. So we made those points clear to Parliament at the time the bill was being debated.
Yeah, and the predecessor committee did look at that as well. Nishalba, really quickly.
Sorry, two very quick questions for me. First one, John, I think you mentioned some of your recommendations that are going to be coming forward, which include, for example, looking at unemployed people who are less likely to have that type of ID. Has there been any further work done on socio-economic background and the connection to voter ID in terms of having those types of identification?
Vijay?
Yes, that probably was the conclusion of our voter ID report. We looked, and Tom may want to come in on more of this, we did quite a lot of checks about which groups were more or less affected by voter ID. I think the strongest correlation that we found was actually with socioeconomic class. C2DE, definitely there was a correlation with them finding it more off-putting and less likely to have voter ID. So that was one of the reasons for. And again, most of our recommendations we're trying to make based on the evidence of what we've then seen in successive elections. That was one of the reasons for the recommendations of broadening the list of voter ID and which ones should be chosen. Sorry.
I think the other groups that we've identified through our research that are much less likely to have already accepted forms of ID include people who are limited severely by disability, and then also people who say that they are renting from a social landlord.
So just in terms of the conversations we've had today around people feeling disenfranchised or feeling that they don't, have a say in their political system and wanting to increase the number of people voting, particularly from, for example, particular backgrounds, ensuring we get that involvement. Do you think that, in your opinion, voter ID is helping or hindering that?
Well, I refer to some of the comments made by the previous panel. Many of or most of us are required to show ID in all kinds of situations now, and particularly migrants and some of the others who are otherwise potentially disenfranchised here. And to that extent, I don't think it makes a difference one way or the other, so long as it's not too restrictive. And I think that has been the complaint we've had throughout, that if you make a very tight list of voter ID, it's indefinitely going to put those that have it in one box, and those that haven't will be disenfranchised unless they make an extra effort. So we very much favour thinking more broadly about particularly the people who are struggling with the policy, and Tom's outlined that, and our research goes into quite a bit of detail, and think, so what is the ID that those people can bring to enable they're not put off?
If I could just add one thing, I think the proposal to have a digital ID would also be really important. We've made that recommendation. It looks very much as if the government is thinking about such a thing, because it came out in, I think, a recent paper from the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. That would make a significant difference. The other thing is communication. We ran a major communications campaign before the general election to make sure that awareness was as high as possible and preferably uniform across the UK. Another one of the concerns that we had was that in areas like Scotland, which had never had an election with voter ID, awareness could be significantly lower than, say, Northern Ireland, which, as John says, has had it for 20 years. Actually, we got to about 90%, the high 80s to 90% uniformly across the UK. And that was important partly for the legitimacy of the process. And finally, we do think this will bed in to some extent. We've already seen it in Northern Ireland in particular, where it's been there for 20 years. People do turn up and the rates are very low of rejection. So Parliament having put the system in place, we can tweak with the list, and that will definitely help. Final point, the lack of consistency between different elections does cause some voters concern. Do they need to bring, for example, voter ID for the next Scottish parliamentary election? No, they don't. But then they're being told in another way that they do for some of the local elections. So I do think there's an element about trying to both work on our communications, but also some consistency in the process.
Thank you. Just moving on swiftly, obviously we could have elections in 12 weeks of May. Upcoming council elections.
As was pointed out earlier, they take up more than proportion of the time to some extent. And does the prospect of unitarisation of district and county councils across the country carry risks, in your opinion, in terms of democratic legitimacy?
The short answer is yes. We're concerned in several ways, and we've been working really closely with the government and MHCLG in particular about this process coming. And first of all, we are very, very close to the May elections. We and local authorities and many of the independent candidates and parties, they're already committing significant funds and have been working up to these elections. So there's just a timing issue for starters. We can see the case for postponing sometimes, but our overall attitude is that scheduled elections should go ahead. Now, clearly, if they're going to waste money, or voters are going to be asked to vote twice, or vote people into a body that won't exist for very long, there are cases for that. And we can see, and there is precedent for some of the local elections being postponed for a year. Where we get extremely nervous, and I think would have grave doubts, is postponement for more than a year. And it is really difficult, because then you've got essentially a council existing almost past its mandate. Certainly it creates problems for voter expectation, for democratic legitimacy, and for the legitimacy of the decision-making that council is doing while these reorganisations are going on. So we hope to hear soon from the government. I think there have been about 18 applications by councils for postponement. My understanding is the government's not going to accept anything like that number, but there has to be a really strong case for postponement, and I think it's got to come back to, are we confusing voters, or are we actually helping voters vote for something meaningful at the time?
Finally, just looking at, we touched on the statement, and I should declare, obviously, I was the shadow minister responding when the government introduced that statement back in February. And the Speaker's Committee also scrutinises the function of the Electoral Commission, and I, in my role as the chair of this committee, sit on that committee as well, just for clarity. In responding to that statement, some of the points that the government outlined was around the Commission should support the effective delivery of the voter ID system and raising awareness. It should support local authorities in terms of issuing the VAC authority forms, and assist the government in terms of tackling voter and electoral fraud. So the predecessor committee looked at the issue of the statement when that was raised. Do you feel that that statement has had an impact on the work that you've had to carry out as a commission, again in light of some of the questions that my colleague Chris Curtis posed to you earlier?
Primary legislation that enables the current government to guide the body that is overseeing future elections needs to be repealed. And the current statement that was made by the government, the Commission considered it, but decided to carry on acting independently because of the overriding requirement that to assure public trust in what we do.
So would you prefer if the government retained or repealed that? And would you...
The primary legislation should be repealed.
Have you done any internal assessment with your staff or of any chilling effect that that statement has had, or noticed anything that happened differently?
I have done my utmost with staff, as has Vijay, to say you carry on as normal. We will continue to act independently because our whole credibility...
Regardless of what that statement said?
Exactly, yes. But of course we considered it, as we're required to do. But then, in the round, looking at everything else that we're required to do, decided we will carry on acting independently. And that was a decision.
So in essence, do you feel that that statement as it stands threatens the independence of the Electoral Commission?
Yes, because it is a threat, because it exists on the statute book. So in the public mind and in many debates in this House, there have been statements about the formally independent Electoral Commission and the government having this power, raising the kinds of questions which Mr Curtis has quite rightly asked of us, which would otherwise have been much less likely to have been raised, because it would have been unthinkable.
Yeah.
Thank you, John, for your sort of highlighting your concerns about the independence. That's really helpful to be honest in front of the committee on that. I think this panel's been really useful, but the previous panel has highlighted the concerns with the electoral law. We as candidates know the electoral law system is not helpful, not fit for purpose. If we as a committee recommended to the government that they do a comprehensive review of electoral law and work with you and other stakeholders on it, would you welcome starting from scratch because the system isn't fit for purpose?
Well, I don't know that we need to start from scratch. I mean, as Peter Stanyon referenced in the previous panel, the Law Commissions of England and Wales and of Scotland have done a significant amount of work at the invitation of the government, which gives us something to start from, which is a properly consolidated, up-to-date picture of law that actually fits together rather than does not at the moment. So we don't need to start from scratch, but we do need a fundamental review that thinks of the electoral system as an entity and as part of our critical national infrastructure.
Thank you. I think at a time when we are looking at the issues around trust in politics and trust in our political system, it is right that we have an electoral system which is separate from Parliament, separate from ministers, so that you can carry out that function with that independence. I would bring today's session to a close. Order.